Well, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you all tonight. It's a beautiful Melbourne evening. Thanks for joining us, and also thank you to all those who are streaming and watching us online. It's that time of year again, the much anticipated launch of the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index. You have it right here, you can see it online. And we are going to be talking about all things power, all things Asia. But before we jump into that discussion with our panelists today, I want to start by giving the customary acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri land and acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians. It's great to have you all here, as I said, for the launch of the 2025 Asia Power Index, which is a detailed examination and measurement of relative power in Asia, measuring 131 indicators across 8 thematic measures. So quite a feat that Susannah and her team do every single year. It's not only military might that they're measuring, but economic capability, influence, resilience, diplomatic and cultural influence, and the strengths of each country's relationships and networks. So this paints a very finely drawn portrait of each country's capabilities and power in their rankings, as I said, relative to one another. And while once again the API reveals a largely bipolar structure with 2 superpowers, China and the US, indexing far above the newly 3rd ranked power, India. This year's index, though, does reveal a lot of change and some uncertainty, and the gap between the United States and China is shrinking. There are shifts in rankings among the middle powers, Australia included, and there's uncertainty about the US's approach to Asia given the Trump administration's America First foreign policy. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this discussion today with our panel of experts. As I said, we've got Susannah Patton, Deputy Director of Research at the Lowy Institute, Program Director for Southeast Asia, and the lead on the Asia Power Index. We've got Strating, a Professor of International Relations at Trobe and Director of the Trobe Center for Global Security. And last but not least, Richard McGregor, Senior Research Fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute and our well-known expert on all things China. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Now, Susannah, of course, we're going to start with you as the lead author of the Asia Power Index. Give us a broad brush overview of what you found in 2025.
Well, thanks so much, Lydia, and it's really great to have Beck and Richard on the panel, because for me the most important thing about the Asia Power Index is not that it provides all the answers to the questions that we're interested in about the distribution of power in Asia, but more just that it can help kick the conversation along. And often to me the most interesting and important part is how different countries respond and react to the findings, as well as other analysts. So this year was a really interesting year. We've obviously seen such a barrage of policies from the Trump administration, and I think unsurprisingly perhaps we found that overall these had been a net negative for US power in Asia. Of course, the Trump administration conceives of its policies, particularly the tariffs, as harnessing what was previously latent economic capability and using it to a more direct effect. But what we found was that actually overall these have been a negative for US diplomatic influence in the region, which fell to its lowest level. We also found that other policies, like, for example, cuts to US development assistance to the region, cuts to the US Agency for Global Media, as well as policies that make it harder for people travelling from Asia to access the US, whether for travel or for education, are all a net negative for US standing in the region. And of course, China, I think, has been the beneficiary because it's been able to position itself as the status quo partner by contrast. The status quo partner in particular that opposes protectionism, because I think, of all of the policies that I've mentioned, there's no doubt that the tariffs have been the most dramatic in terms of shifting perceptions of the United States in Asia. Now, there are some areas where the US still has huge advantages, in particular in the area of defense and security partnerships, and that's also been the area where the Trump administration has had the most continuity. Thinking about alliances with Australia, with Japan, with the Philippines have been much more characterized by continuity than some of the other policy areas that I mentioned. But concerningly for the US, the area where China does continue to make gains year on year, going back to when the Asia Power Index was first published in 2018, is when we're talking about the unilateral military capability. So not so much the defense partnerships, but which country has the most overall capable military in Asia, and China continues to advance on the US there. And of course, China's forces are overwhelmingly concentrated in Asia, whereas the US is globally dispersed. And actually this year, even more so if we look at what's happening with the flow of US forces to the Western Hemisphere, which is a really striking development, and I think something that Australia should be watching closely. So that's just a quick burst on some of the top level findings when it comes to US and China, but of course we can dive deeper into other countries as well, because although, as Lydia, you said, the region, we do conceive of it as being bipolar, meaning that it's sort of two superpowers, that doesn't mean that other countries aren't also relevant to some extent. So.
Well, Susannah, I might ask you just a follow-up question in terms of your measurements. So this year, for the first time, you measured an indicator around economic statecraft. Can you tell us a little bit about why you folded that in 2025 and how you did it and what that revealed about economic statecraft in the region?
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. So the Asia Power Index is very much a bottom-up index, and I won't get too deep into the weeds of the methodology here because you can look at it for yourself if you're interested. But we have more than 130 indicators looking at everything from trade and investment to the size of armed forces to the size of diplomatic networks. And for the most part, we try and keep these indicators consistent over the years because that enables us to compare more accurately what's actually changing. But we also try and put in new indicators where we can to capture trends or developments that have become more important. So for example, during the COVID pandemic, we included vaccine diplomacy as something that many countries were focused on at that time. And this year we added a new indicator on economic statecraft, as you mentioned, Lydia, to try and capture really which countries are perceived as being the most adept at harnessing their economic capabilities for the benefit of their own statecraft, so to their own national benefit. And we did that by adding a question to our expert survey, which we do each year, which forms a component of diplomatic influence. And I guess what was interesting there was that, the countries that performed really well in that indicator were countries like, of course, China, also Vietnam, South Korea, Japan were perceived as, more adept at economic statecraft, and, the US less so, which, I read as a reflection in particular of the tariff policies, because that survey was done after the Trump administration announced its major tariffs on the region. And of course, to some extent, the impact of the tariffs is very much still to be felt in terms of over the longer term. Is it going to drive a more distant relationship in terms of investment and trade between the United States and Asia? But we can see early on that at the level of diplomacy, those tariffs have obviously landed with a thud.
Susannah. Richard and Beck, let me bring you in. What stood out to you about the findings? Was there anything that was aligned with what you were tracking in Asia, something that you felt was a bit different from what you were perceiving and also tracking? Maybe, Richard, I'll start with you.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that, if you come here tonight, you probably take the list seriously. This is not a list like the old BuzzFeed list, a listicle or something like that. It has real methodological rigor, plus a lot of data. And I might say that since I travel a lot, it's taken quite seriously. Maybe it's a bit of a power listicle in the region. India went up a place this year, and that was all over the Indian media. China went down after COVID. At that time, they attacked us as running dogs of US imperialism. When it went up, of course, they said we were very wise analysts. So of course they do take this seriously. And Susannah herself, with me, she presented on this at Peking University. So we can't present on a lot of our research in China, but on something like this, because the Chinese are quite obsessed with what they call comprehensive national power, this really hits home. So I guess the main point for me, I think the most interesting thing is that, you know, China and the US number one, China number two, but what we've really seen this year, I think, has been a moment in history, and the list reflects, the index, I should say, reflects this, that China and the US are just, particularly in Asia, are really peer powers these days. And I think we had a pivotal moment when China used the threat of withholding critical minerals from the US and the rest of the world, and the US had to come scrambling back to the negotiating table. And look what has happened since. Now, partly this is Trump. Trump really doesn't care about military balance so much. I mean, he cares about the threat of use of military force, but not sort of long-term military balance in the way that other American leaders have. He really looks at economics and economic statecraft. And since the Chinese used the threat of critical minerals to bring him back to the negotiating table, he sat down with Xi Jinping. They've now agreed on reciprocal visits to Washington and Beijing by both leaders. And Trump since then has been quite obsessed about stabilizing the relationship. Oh, we need a microphone, sorry.
It's just cutting out a bit.
Sorry, Trump since then has been quite obsessed with stabilising the relationship with China. Like, we have critics in Australia about whether Australia should stabilise the relationship with China. Look at America. I'll give you a few examples. The really big one was in the last week with Japan and China fighting over the status of Taiwan. Trump has said nothing in support of Japan. Japan is America's most important ally. Japan has more troops in its country than in any other place in the world. Trump has said nothing in support of Japan. Trump has lifted sanctions which had been announced against Ministry of State Security entities in China. And in the last day, we had quite another remarkable announcement that Trump has agreed to sell really powerful NVIDIA chips, which the Chinese can use to, you know, train their AI mechanisms. These are called H200. I'm learning this like all of us are, but these are 6 times more powerful than any other of the chips that the US has sold to China before. They were banned previously. This is an area, by the way, the Americans have a big lead, but Trump has thrown that out. Now, of course, he could reverse himself tomorrow. We never know. There's a big fight within the US administration about AI policy and about how to sanction or what to withhold from China. But Trump has just thrown all that out. He's untethered by any previous decisions by any other president, untethered by precedent. And I think the reason is because he sees China as a peer power. And these days is really not willing to take them on directly. At least we have, by the way, a year's grace. That's how long the critical minerals moratorium on the ban lasts for. We'll see what happens after that. But I think that remains, for me, not the measure of US 1, China 2, but they're very, very close.
Thanks, Richard. I want to come back to you actually about the future of US-China relationships, but I'll go to Beck and ask, what stood out to you, Beck? Anything surprise you? What was your main takeaway from the findings this year?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the Lowy Institute for inviting me along, and congratulations to Susannah and the team. There's a lot of work that goes into this obviously, but one of the most useful things I think about these sorts of resources is that it can confirm what we might be observing, even if we ourselves don't always have the means to track this in such fine detail. So I would, my sort of takeaway is similar to Richard's. This idea that China and the United States polar region, I think this sort of demonstrates that we are really talking about a bipolar region. And even though India, I think, went up a place, was it this year or last year maybe, that its ambitions may not be fulfilled in the way that it would like in terms of creating that multipolar vision. one of the things that I would say is that what I've been thinking about a lot is what the United States' attitude to strategic competition is. And in fact, it aligns with what Richard was just saying about not really wanting to take China on directly. And a lot of the ways that we measure strategic competition, or the ways that we think about it in terms of diplomacy, information, economic and military dimensions, the United States over 2025 has really seeded the field on a number of those, particularly when it comes to diplomacy and information. And economic competition might be through tariffs, and treating allies as rivals is more what we're seeing in 2025. And strategic competition is a term that's only used once in the newly released National Security Strategy, which is quite different from 2017 National Security Strategy under Trump. So this idea that the US is in decline confirms what I would have expected. There's nothing surprising there, I don't think. The fact that the US is perhaps precipitating its own decline is also an interesting takeaway. And the other thing that I found quite interesting is what the API has to say about China's positioning of itself as a reliable partner in the region. So I've been keeping an eye on the narratives, particularly in Southeast Asia, where China is trying to promote itself as a much more reliable partner in the context of US uncertainty about US intentions. I'm interested that the index suggests that this narrative has been successful, because that, I think, is harder to track. So I was kind of wondering whether this is something that you've gleaned from the conversations that you are having with experts in the region, that not just that China's trying to present this image, but that it's successful in doing that. Because I would also suggest that there's probably still scepticism in Southeast Asia about some of China's, particularly on the economic side. And finally, the surprising thing for me was Russia. And I think that might have to do more with its relationships in Northeast Asia, so with China and North Korea, than what it does with other parts of the region. And in some ways, Russia has sort of reclaimed its place rather than necessarily lost its place. But I don't pay a lot of attention to Russia in the region, I have to confess. And so that one was a surprising point for me.
Yeah, thanks, Beck. I was also surprised too that the United States, even though it was showing declines in other areas, that its cultural influence went up in the region. I found that very surprising, given the America First posture, the tariffs, the immigration restrictions. So that's an interesting one. I kind of was puzzled about that. Richard, I want to go back to you. You spoke about the U.S.'s kind of stance toward China. Beck mentioned the newly released National Security Strategy. That strategy really put a lot of emphasis in terms of respecting state sovereignty, yes, but it positions China very clearly as a competitor. Do you see a disconnect between this newly released strategy versus all of the ways that you described how Trump was acting toward China? And I'll ask you the reverse. What about China's posture to the United States? What should we expect in terms of the future of U.S.-China relations, but from the Chinese side?
Yeah, I think there's inbuilt competition between China and the United States. Over a long period of time, of course, the US has seen China as its main competitor, particularly now. They use that odd phrase, they call it I think it's the pacing threat or the pacing competitor, which is sort of both a tribute to China and also slightly patronizing. I think that, Trump is, if you read the National Security Strategy, in his first National Security Strategy in 2017, which I think was largely written by the likes of Matt Pottinger, who worked at the National Security Council at the time, I think they co-joined Russia and China together as revisionist powers. That is completely absent from this one. Russia is almost completely absent. And the focus on China is about what Jake Sullivan called, one of Biden's advisors, a foreign policy for the middle class. In other words, looking at economic issues, economic statecraft, a restoration of US economic preeminence, particularly in reindustrialization and the like. So that's Trump's focus. It does, to be fair, talk a little bit about Taiwan. I don't think Trump cares about Taiwan, but I think he's, as I think somebody said about Trump, he has a kind of feral intelligence. He understands instinctively how important Taiwan is, not just because it's a semiconductor manufacturing superpower, but because he understands how important it is to China. And so I think the most important thing Trump said about Taiwan was in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, I think in October last year before the election, when he said, and I'm going to censor this slightly because the paper did, he said, well, Xi Jinping would never invade Taiwan while I'm in office because he knows I'm effing crazy. And I think that's kind of accurate and kind of a good thing to have embedded in the Chinese mind. So, neither the US and China are looking to fight a war. China certainly is not looking to fight a war over Taiwan. It would like to take it without a fight, as it were. There's the old joke that in recent years, I think the US has been fighting without winning. China likes to win without fighting, kind of the opposite. But I think Taiwan is much, much harder than many people realize to actually take over, let alone to bring to heel and then to take over. And then there's the issue actually that I'm working on is how China would occupy Taiwan, right? It's not so easy. Taiwan's a real country, real political parties, real government, real private sector, real media, real rule of law, real NGOs. Can China just walk in and bring it all to heel? So it's a very difficult issue, and both are sort of walking around it quite gingerly, but certainly China sees America as its main obstacle on the Taiwan issue. And they want to talk to Trump more about that and sort of get him to sort of pull away from it. It's hard to know what China's view is, whether it's a short-term issue or a longer-term issue. But certainly for China, they would like the US, I think, to sort of go into sort of, bourgeois decline on the other side of the Pacific. But I really don't think that is likely, despite Trump's lack of interest in allies and sort of forward deployment and the like.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so Susannah, we talked about US-China, the two major superpowers in the region. Let's bring in a discussion about the middle powers. Talk to us about the API's findings on the rankings, particularly of Southeast Asian countries this year.
I will, very happy to do that. Can I just pick up on a couple of the just the questions that have been raised in the previous answers, because I think they're relevant to consider as well. You mentioned, Lydia, the US cultural influence. And one of the ways that we actually measure cultural influence is by looking at the reach of media outlets. So which newspapers have the highest uptake in the region, which news agencies, radio, etc. And one really interesting thing, of course, is that in a presidential election year, which we had last year, there's huge interest in the US. And you might say, well, so what? But to me, an even more striking data point is the amount of interest, not just in Australia, but elsewhere around the world in the New York mayoral election, right? That is striking how much focus there was in Australia. And to me, that is a really good data point of why the US remains so culturally influential, because people think that what happens in the New York mayoral election has an impact on them when they're living here in Australia, in a way that is definitely not true of local politics in sort of pretty much any other country in the world. So I think it's striking. So in terms of the middle powers, we define most countries in the region as middle powers. India we define as a major power, and that was something new this year from India's sort of gradual increase in its score. And of course, I think with India, it's always a kind of glass half full versus glass half empty equation, because although India's power has been growing in line with, the pace of its economic growth, its diplomatic projection, etc., It's also got one of the largest, what we call in the index, power gap of any country in the region. So this is a term we use to describe the interplay between a country's resources, so what they have, and their influence, so what they do with what they have. And India has the largest, or one of the largest power gaps of any country. And you can either see that as potential, which is yet to be unlocked, or you can see it as a failure to project, in line with its capacity. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, is similar to what we see with other like high population developing countries in the region, like Indonesia. Of course, population is not just a resource to be harnessed, it's also a burden to be maintained through health, education, social welfare, and that requires a lot of internal focus for these countries. And, the classic comparison that we would always give would be Singapore, a country which has very small population, very small landmass, but it's got this ability to project and to network internationally in a much bigger way. A couple of other countries that were also striking this year, Indonesia is, we define it as a middle power. It was interesting that under the new president Prabowo, Indonesia was evaluated in our diplomatic survey as having more global ambition but less regional ambition. That's interesting because it aligns with the fact that President Prabowo has been quite focused on globe-trotting, on joining the BRICS as one of his first acts in power. I think the BRICS is very interesting. It goes to sort of Beck's question around to what extent is the narrative of China and Russia cutting through in the region, but Prabowo has been less focused on ASEAN and developments closer to home. Meanwhile, of course, for the rest of Southeast Asia, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Malaysia had a very good year, and Prime Minister Anwar, I think, has impressed a lot of people with his leadership of ASEAN. That's obviously wound up now, and we have other countries like Thailand and Cambodia, the most notable one where, there's a lot of internal focus and an inability to kind of lead because of this conflict, which has now just flared up over the last couple of days. So I would say Southeast Asia is very much a mixed bag. And just briefly to wrap up my answer to this question, another sort of dynamic which I think is interesting to think about from Australia's perspective is that other big Indo-Pacific powers like Japan and South Korea have had leadership churn, and that affects their ability to sort of project power and influence, because I think one phenomenon that we see in our data over and again is that countries that have a high level of leadership churn don't have the same level of diplomatic influence as countries that have established leaders who can build rapport and who've got the domestic bandwidth to do the travel and the engagement.
Thanks, Susannah. Beck, I might get your thoughts on that as well in terms of the middle powers in the Southeast Asian states. What do you think this year tells us about prospects for regional cooperation and competition, particularly in light, I think, of the decline in U.S. power that you were talking about? There'll be some opportunities and drawbacks for some of the Southeast Asian states as well because of that. So what do you make of that? What are your reflections?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's one that I think those of us who are paying attention in the region are thinking a lot about. What are the opportunities and drawbacks? And I think, Susannah, you've done an amazing job of talking about the implications for Southeast Asia. I wanted to pick up on the point about Malaysia, though, because one of the interesting facts in this is exactly what you said about Malaysia's sort of rising influence. It has been a very active player. It's using its convening power, and it managed to get Trump to Southeast Asia and avoided a Zelensky moment, which I think was also something that Malaysia leadership was really interested in. But I guess the question is, at what cost and at what long-term cost, because Malaysia also signed a trade deal and there were concerns that trade deal with the United States actually comes with some unfavourable consequences. So a short-term lift in diplomatic influence may come with a longer-term cost when it comes to the economics and the deal that some have been describing as quite rushed and perhaps ill-considered. So I think in terms of your question about what the decline of US power means for countries in the region, for Southeast Asia, a lot of the countries are hedges. So hedges need options, and when it comes to US allies, Australia being one of them, but also Japan, Korea, New Zealand, the Philippines, or not New Zealand, but the Philippines, they're also sort of wanting to see the United States maintain its presence and power in the region. So in the sense that we see that there are countries that might be wary of the United States, and, you know, some of those are good historical reasons to be wary of the United States. They also need the US there, I think, to counterbalance China. And so while different countries will be, I think, have different responses to Trump policies and to the decline of US power, there is also a sense that this is creating a structural condition that all states need to deal with. And there is also this question about what US policies and what US decline means more generally for what Australia refers to as the rules-based order. So I think Australia and some other countries like Japan and New Zealand, Philippines, might be concerned about what US decline more generally might mean for some of the rules that uphold a regional order that, I mean, for Australia's sake, has been very favourable to Australia's security and prosperity.
So, Susannah, you mentioned the leadership churn in Japan and South Korea. Richard, I might bring you in and ask you a bit about that, because both South Korea and Japan there were downward trends in various aspects of the ranking for both of them, including things like economic capability, resilience, potential for future resources. But, you know, there were some improvements on other measures as well. So can you reflect about how much of an impact do you think that leadership churn had, or what's happening in those two countries right now in 2025 in terms of their future prospects?
Yeah, I mean, I think the leadership churn is important, but it's not the main issue. It's more a sort of secular relative decline, but relative. They're not unimportant countries, and they will be important for a long time. Let me give you a context. There's a very popular, fashionable, a theme in international relations years called the Thucydides trap. By the way, don't say that word Thucydides I won't say it after I had a few wines at dinner. You know, it's to emphasise to get it out. Anyway, the Thucydides trap in theory is, rising power inevitably sort of runs up and fights an established power. And I don't think that's a good framework for these days. A much better framework is something else that Thucydides said, and I'll paraphrase, that, it's dangerous to build an empire. It's even more dangerous to give it away. And we might be seeing that with the US at the moment. And the most important countries in our region, leaving aside Australia, are Japan and South Korea. I mean, if you think about the region since 1945, the end of the war, we have all these frozen in the 50s conflicts. Chinese Civil War, never solved. Korean Civil War, never solved. Japanese-Chinese tensions, never resolved. We've seen it again in recent weeks. The only thing really holding it all together is the US. And we can all criticise big bad America and blame it for this, that and the other, but Asia would not have developed economically without US security. Now, nobody should expect China to rely, and also Chinese economic development benefited greatly from that. The US kept the peace. And no, I don't expect China was never going to sort of allow that to go on forever, and we're seeing that now. But really, what happens in Japan and South Korea? For Japan and South Korea, certainly for Taiwan, and in some respects for Australia, there's no plan B. You know, without the United States, none of these countries can handle China. So it's really, Trump in that respect is quite existential. So I think that's a big point. In terms of the leadership churn in South Korea, there were particularly circumstances with President Yoon, who staged a coup. How ridiculous in a country like South Korea these days, and he was rightly thrown out. His replacement, left of centre, President Lee, many people expected him to sort of rush off to China and to spurn the United States. He hasn't done that. And in part, that's because I think the Koreans have tried that before and they got nothing from the Chinese, and because public opinion in South Korea is very anti-China. Japan, since Abe, we've really had not churn, but sort of relative instability, relative weakness at the top, which has really been the case in Abe aside in Japan since the 90s. And of course, Takaichi, who's taken over, the first woman prime minister, she's got a new coalition. The stability of that coalition is untested. And of course, China is doing its best to break her leadership at the moment. Both South Korea and Japan are well into demographic decline. As Susannah said, demographics is not destiny, but it's important. Japan's losing 1 million people a year. And of course, as China becomes a tech power, the first countries that they really start to cannibalize are Japan, South Korea, and Germany. And we're seeing that now. And so for all those reasons, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for those countries, particularly as Trump treats them so transactionally. One other point, I mean, you read the national security strategy, it's all about how we should work with our allies on economic statecraft in Asia to push back against China. Well, Trump hasn't been doing that. He's just been kicking them around. So for all of those countries have reason to worry. You know, American troops have been in Japan for 70 years. Are they going to be there for another 70 years? I doubt it. What happens?
Well, pretty soon we'll be able to open up to questions, so have your questions ready. But I want to ask the panelists a last question before we do so, and that's about Australia. We've had our share of leadership churn over the decades, and this year Australia has fallen to 6th in the rankings. Do you think this has surprised policymakers and leadership in Canberra? Should it have surprised them? And what would you advise them either to reverse this trend or to make the most effective use of what power Australia holds at the moment? Maybe Suzanne, I'll start with you.
So I mentioned before some countries get very interested in what their Asia Power Index score tells them, and countries believe themselves to be quite powerful and important. Australia is not one of those countries. Often when I talk about these findings and the idea that Australia is even the 6th most powerful country in Asia, people say, "Aren't you rating us a bit too high? We're not that important."
Very Australian.
Very Australian, very self-deprecating. What I think is interesting in this year's findings, and I think is more broadly true, is that Australia's diplomatic ambition remains quite strong. I think I consider that this current Albanese government has been pretty ambitious, especially in its foreign policy in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and we've seen the signing of these new deals with PNG, with Indonesia, with more in the works, with the Philippines, with other countries in the Pacific, as well as much deeper security ties with Japan as well. But our ability to kind of fund that or resource these partnerships has not changed, because our military capability is growing much more slowly than most other countries in Asia. Our economy is not growing as fast as others. And so what this raises is the long-term question. We're making new security commitments, developing new security partnerships. how are we actually going to resource that? And what will this actually mean in practice? And I think that question is particularly acute in the case of the partnership with Japan, where Japan is a country that I think has expectations of Australia. With some of the more regional relationships, they may be comfortable with just a more sort of symbolic level of partnership. They may not want us to do anything particularly on the practical front. But I think in the longer term, Australia faces, a gap between its ambition and its resourcing.
Yeah, I mean, Australia obviously has great diplomatic challenges. I mean, we'll look at what's happening this week. We've got AUSMIN in Washington, that is Defence and Foreign Ministers of both countries meeting. AUKUS, full steam ahead, that was the message. Plus a whole lot of commitments by Australia to the United States. We've got the subs in Perth, more Marines in Darwin, stationing of other resources in the Northern Territory and Queensland, and the like. So Penny Wong will go from there to Japan, where she'll be under pressure to, make a statement with the Japanese about the current campaign of Chinese coercion. Very sensitive, and she goes straight from there to Beijing, which of course hates what's happening with AUKUS and will hate anything she says in Japan. So, it's a real balancing act there for us, but the good news is that everybody's doing the balancing. Secondly, I think, we can be pessimistic about Australia. I sort of vary. I'm having a good day today, though, because I'm down in Melbourne. I have lived here a couple of times, but, Victoria gets a lot of bad press these days. I don't want to go into that, but, Melbourne, walking around today, what a lovely day. What a great city. Melbourne has great bones, and I think Australia does as well. So we've got a very resilient democracy, a highly educated population, lots of resources, a good bureaucracy in Canberra, dare I say it. The Australian Public Service is a national asset, even though it doesn't work properly all the time. So we should be a little bit more optimistic, but it is going to be harder. And just give you one example, the Pacific. Penny Wong rightly calls that a permanent competition with China. So we just should get used to it. We're not going to win. China's not going to lose. It's what the Chinese call struggle. So we just have to put our shoulders to the wheel. So it's a matter of national effort and marshalling all our resources, not overreacting, and the like. Now, nothing I've said has much to do with why Australia fell down on the list this year, because people in India takes notice, China takes notice, but we don't take notice. But I don't think we should worry about whether we go up or down a few places in any year. I mean, our fate is in our own hands.
Yes, there's a disadvantage in going last on these questions, because actually what I wanted to say has been covered by both Susannah and Richard, particularly today. The AUSMIN announcement and the full steam ahead was everywhere in the media today, I think, which really to me demonstrates that Australia is not going to be moving away from the US alliance anytime soon, but it really does need to think about how it's going to at least hedge against its dependence on the United States, as Susannah and Richard were talking about, the sorts of relationships it needs to deepen in the region, how it's going to prioritise resources in order to be able to do that, and how it's going to work more effectively with partners. And actually, one of the things that surprised me was that Australia's defence diplomacy was down, because it feels to me like there are more and more activities, there are more and more, alignments and agreements that are being made, and to see that was actually that little part of Australia's diplomacy was down was quite surprising. I wasn't so surprised that the regional diplomacy was up, though, more generally. I was in Canberra last week, and I was with I was working alongside Dr. Ian Story from the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, who has just written a book on Putin's Russia and Southeast Asia. And so we had a series of meetings in DFAT, and I think they were a bit surprised about the Russia thing as well. And so there were lots of questions about, why, what is it about Russia Russia that has contributed to sort of leapfrogging Australia. But as I said, it seems to be more of a rectifying of the situation. So, yeah, I think Australia does need to be thinking about diversification economically, diplomatically, and militarily.
Well, yeah, please, Susannah. Yep.
I thought I might just mention just a bit, seeing as Russia's come up a couple of times, I might just mention a bit about Russia's ranking in the index. So this year, Russia regained ranking as the 5th most powerful country. And I think it reflects a couple of things. So one is, you know, as Beck said, growing partnerships with both China and North Korea, with, you know, those countries becoming more important for Russia. But also, I think, and that's true both in terms of the trade, the economic relationship with China, but also defence security cooperation. That comes through very clearly in our data which tracks defence dialogues, combined military exercises. But I think another factor is that there's been some rebounding in Russia's reputation, especially in Southeast Asia and other non-aligned countries. Following the invasion of Ukraine, I think, you know, there was an initial period where countries were more wary and restrained about engaging with Russia. And I think, you know, pretty clearly over the past year or so that has ended. And countries like, you know, Indonesia are doing more with Russia. They're embracing Russian initiatives like the BRICS. So I think it's really a kind of, yeah, a rebounding of those relationships rather than, you know, Russia doing a lot more across the region, because of course its presence is very patchy. It's limited to arms sales, you know, in particular now to Myanmar, you know, which is obviously a very kind of unique case. And a lot of what Russia has been doing with the rest of the region, like, for example, a new naval exercise with Indonesia, that's really just a form of advertising to say, hey, we're still here, we're a great power, even though as an economic player, Russia is pretty negligible overall in Asia.
Thanks, Susannah. Well, we have time now for audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you. Just the gentleman here, if you could please confine it to a question. Thank you.
I was wondering if the leaders of the Asian countries see Trumpism as an aberration, and after 3 more years, everything will settle back down to normal as it was beforehand.
Well, I think none of us really know, and I don't think they know. I think their knowledge of Washington in many of the ASEAN countries on the ground, it depends on their ambassador, but also relative to, say, us, Europe and the like, is pretty low. You know, some of them find him transactional. Braboa kind of likes that, or seems to like it. He wants to do deals. But if you go, I was in the ASEAN headquarters this year, and a fairly senior official said to me, we're done with America. But he said, but please don't give us over to China. So they're not really done with America. They're not done with the American private sector. Many of ASEAN countries, their biggest market is still the US. And by the way, it's a fantasy to think that China can replace the US in Asia for this 2 reasons. Number one, China will never be the final destination for exports from ASEAN countries. You know, China is flooding ASEAN countries with its own exports now, and it mainly imports raw materials and parts to put into its final exports. It can never play the role of America. You know, you would have seen in the last couple of days, you know, China's trade surplus, global trade surplus this year is already $1 trillion, right? So this is not a country like America. Secondly, you think about it, China, the US has no territorial disputes in Asia, right? Obviously it's not there, but it has been the sort of hegemonic power, no longer. But China has disputes of different kinds, leaving aside India, maritime China, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia. That's even without mentioning Taiwan. So can they, you know, sort of seamlessly go into the region as the sort of keeper of the peace? I don't think so. So a region without America, most people realise they don't like Trump. They don't like American arrogance. They don't like American excesses. But a region without America is inherently unstable.
Beck, you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to briefly add that I think that there are a lot of leaders in Asia that might like the fact that they're not going to be lectured about democracy under this administration as well.
Good point. We had a question from the gentleman, the row up here. If we could just give the microphone.
Yes, you spoke about Paul. Is your name?
Sorry?
Is your name Paul?
No, Richard.
Sorry, Richard. You
Paul up here.
Richard, you spoke about
Paul, yeah.
existing tensions from the Second World War that haven't dissipated or gone away. I presume that's a product of the Marshall Plan. And
Marshall Plan's Europe.
sorry. Yes. Well, then I can't imagine what's causing those tensions in Asia. Maybe ethnic tensions that haven't gone away when Japan was invading China, but something has to be done to reconcile those tensions. So I'm wondering whether the report measures internal cohesion of the societies and whether that aspect has a big role to play on how the local populations trust its leaders. And also, why hasn't Ukraine got a mention? I mean, they're holding back a big power, and the US is sort of threatening the Ukraine to hand over a lot of its resources.
So, Susannah, maybe you can talk about the resilience measurement and just
Yes.
clarifying that it's an Asia Power Index.
Yeah, that's right. So we limit our scope to Asia. So there's an assumption implicit in there that primarily geopolitics is about different theatres of competition rather than one global theatre. So we look at Asia. When we look at countries that are in Asia, either by virtue of their geography or their membership of regional organisations or their military commitments. And we do look at resilience because, of course, internal cohesion as well as broader resilience like geopolitical resilience, some countries are just more stable and cohesive as a result of their geography, their level of economic development, their history of internal conflict. So, yeah, we do take all those into consideration.
We had a question from the gentleman in the back there.
Thanks very much. I'm Talal Raza, PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, and as a South Asia researcher, I've been very interested in how the index ranks Pakistan and India. And one of the findings that stood out for me is how India has been ranked for the first time as a major power. And one of the data points that has been mentioned in the report is how India's performance in Operation Sindoor really demonstrated its military capability. Now, this might be a contentious observation in Pakistan because for many experts, Operation Sindoor did not achieve the objectives. In fact, India, depending on which news source you rely on, has actually lost 3 to 6 airplanes. So in the light of this, how would you respond to the likely critique that assertions of projecting India as a major power are exaggerated? And linked to that question, if you set aside the contentious data point of India's performance on Operation Sindoor, would you still consider India a major power, or would you like India as a highly ranked middle power?
I saw a couple of other hands up. Just for the interest of time, maybe we'll take those and then wrap them up. So maybe this woman in the back and then the gentleman in the middle.
Hi. Hello? Great. I was really interested in the Cultural Influence Index. 2 things that are mentioned here is on media flows and universities. So I was really surprised to see, it was mentioned earlier that the United States increased in their cultural influence, which I find very fascinating because I would assume that now with the ability to, like, media may be global, but it's also completely decentralized. So people are creating their own media. It might be flowing through, companies that are established in Silicon Valley, but I would be assuming that those echo chambers exist like within their countries. And the second question, like tangentially related, is that China's increase in cultural influence I find interesting because lots of their media is internal and doesn't actually leave China, which is why I'm interested to see how that was measured.
So we've got question about India, media influences, and then the last question from the gentleman here, and we'll throw it back to the panelists.
So historically, often naval and commercial shipping power has been a very important determinant of global power. So Australia being an island nation, having a huge coastline. So what are the opportunities for us, and also what are the drawbacks or the risks we face? How does AUKUS play into all this in terms of our influence in the region? And should we be developing shipping and things like that, or is that less relevant than it used to be? Thank you.
Thank you. We might take it in reverse order. Maybe Beck, start with you, if you can offer any reflections on those three questions.
I might just take the last question about naval and commercial shipping power, because that is a concern for the United States, obviously. I mean, the US this year has been really concerned about being competitive when it comes to shipbuilding, recognising that it conducts less than 1% of building the world's ships, and there has been a number of policy announcements and declarations out of the United States about increasing that rate to be competitive against China, which is doing, I think, I could be wrong, but about 74% of that shipbuilding. So Australia is investing in the US industrial base through AUKUS. So when when leaders go to Washington with a cheque for AUKUS, they are contributing essentially to trying to lift the US's shipbuilding, particularly submarine building capabilities, in order for the United States then to be able to pass over the Virginia-class submarines as part of AUKUS. AUKUS Pillar 2, I think there is a lot of discussions also about how Australia engages with not just the United States and the United Kingdom as part of AUKUS, but other countries in the region on a range of different technologies. But there's a lot of limitations, I think, when it comes to thinking about Australia's own naval and commercial shipping capabilities. There is a narrative that the Australian government uses that AUKUS is about nation building, and it's about, building up the economy. It's military Keynesianism. I'm not sure that that is actually true. So while there are probably some niche opportunities for Australia to be involved in regional collaboration, I think we need to be realistic in those expectations.
So on the question about India and Pakistan, the way that came into our data is for military capability, we do an expert survey each year which looks at the question, so not just how many tanks does each country have, but are the tanks well maintained. One of the questions that we also ask is about combat experience. Of course, people who are responding to our survey will assess that India has higher combat experience as a result of Operation Sindoor. And obviously, there are lessons learned going on that will contribute to India's future military capability. So that's how I would describe it, is that India has increased its combat experience. We don't pass any kind of verdict on who won a particular conflict. Pakistan also increased its combat experience. So did other countries with conflicts in the region like Thailand and Cambodia as well. So the question around the middle power thing, it's interesting. I like the term major power because it's very generic and it's very sort of value neutral, whereas middle power, especially for people who are international relations scholars such as yourself, it implies a certain quality, whereas we also characterise North Korea as a middle power. So I like the term major power myself. China and cultural influence, just maybe briefly to mention, China doesn't really project in the media sense, but one other aspect of cultural influence that we look at is to do with people exchanges, so tourism, travel, flight connections, and that's really China's area of advantage in Asia, and I think it's going to become more so. One interesting thing is that China is opening up much more visa-free travel for countries from Asia, as well, of course, as continued trend of Chinese tourists outbound from China, and I think that's, an area of strength, especially when the US is pulling back.
I'd say very briefly, actually, Chinese has a global media footprint these days. CGTN 24/7 news channels, very sophisticated now. They put a lot of money into it, English, Arabic, French. So, we might look at that and think it's propaganda, but, most people in most countries don't look at it in the way that we look at it. So don't underestimate Chinese media. On the shipping issue, I think what America is talking about when they're talking about cooperation with South Korea and Japan is mainly shipping, because South Korea and Japan are still major shipbuilding powers. China hasn't wiped them out completely. They have enormous capability in that and experience. And of course, one of the fascinating things, AUKUS gets kind of a lot of bad press here in many respects. The South Koreans have also won an agreement. I don't know whether it's ever going to happen, but they also are going to get nuclear-powered submarine technology from America and have said that they will build it for America in America. Now, I doubt that's the case. The Americans don't have the workforce. The South Koreans say, we can't, you can't build it, we'll do it. But they want to do that as well.
Well, we've unpacked so much of the Asia Power Index in our panel today, but there's still so much more that can be delved into, not only in the major findings report, but also in the interactive on our website. So I encourage you all to take a look further, click around on the interactive. It's a lot of fun to go through. And please join me in thanking the three panelists here tonight.